All right, here we are. We're live. Welcome everybody to the Psychedelic Success Show. I'm your host, Kiana Prema, and I'm so happy to be here with co-host Ashley Booth. Ashley is the founder of the Aware Project. And we have a special guest joining us today, Emanuel. Emanuel, please help me with your last name. I still haven't gotten it.
It's Sferios, like
oh, really? It's so long the whole time. Sferios. Okay, cool. Is that Greek?
It is.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you so much for that. So we are so glad to welcome you all here tonight. We are talking about psychedelic medicines to heal veterans in honor of Veterans Day. And Emanuel is a really amazing person in the field. He's been doing so much for the use of psychedelics, or however you want to refer to them, especially in the field of MDMA. He's the founder of DanceSafe. I founded that in 1998, which is an organization that tests ecstasy, so you know what you're getting when you're going into a party scenario. And he's been a longtime activist, and he's the director of a new film coming out called MDMA the Movie. Manuel, would you like to tell us a little bit about the movie?
Sure. Let me add one more thing to DanceSafe, though, because everyone recognizes DanceSafe's drug checking services, but also DanceSafe primarily is a peer-based drug education project where young people educate each other on the safer use of party drugs, especially. So, and MDMA the movie, I'd always wanted to make a documentary on MDMA. I mean, for years and years I've been thinking about it because, well, right, nobody's ever done it. And there have been, movies made on marijuana, on heroin, even on meth and crack cocaine. But, MDMA is the second most popular illicit drug among under 30s after marijuana, and there hasn't been a definitive documentary made on it. I think one of the reasons why is that people have a hard time reconciling the fact that on the one hand, this drug has saved many people's lives. It's one of the more therapeutic of the psychedelics out there. Really, it's in a class all its own. Whereas on the other hand, it's contributed to many deaths. And, why is that happening? I think we've either had really good stories on MDMA therapy that have just ignored the recreational side, or we've had these really alarmist, kind of sensationalistic, docs or news reports on the recreational side. And I wanted to bring these two things together and show the full truth around MDMA. Because I've worked so long in harm reduction, I understand the risks and dangers of using MDMA in recreational settings, better than any drug warrior does. And also I can explain the solutions. I've thought for decades about how we can solve this problem. And so, I thought I'm the best person to do this. So a couple years ago, I started this journey, and I'm still in the early stages of production, but I'm not going to quit until it's done. And I know it's going to be the definitive documentary on MDMA, and also a mainstream drug policy reform film. One of the things I like to say is I'm not making a niche film that's going to only be appealing to MDMA users. I want to make a film that appeals to soccer moms. So I'm going to explore universal themes like love and empathy, how to talk to your teenager about drugs, different drug abuse prevention approaches, addiction treatment. How does MDMA fit in all this? Not to mention the veterans and rape survivors and others with PTSD who have been helped by the drugs. So I think there's a lot of mainstream appeal in the topic, and if it's done right, we can win awards at film festivals and really help move the conversation forward around drug policy in this country and the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're excited.
Yeah, thank you so much for this work. It's really potent and important. Emanuel, so we're talking today about veterans and how we can heal veterans, and MDMA is one of those solutions that is out there. The viewers at home may know that this is something that's being studied by MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. and has gone through several trials now. They're moving into stage 3, right?
Yeah, phase 3 studies. About a year or so they should begin.
Great. But would you maybe help bring us up to speed just a little bit on the history of MDMA as a whole?
The history as a whole, yeah, sure. In a nutshell, I mean, there's a lot of myths around that. It's a good question because a lot of people don't know things, or they think they know things that aren't true. Like, for example, it was not developed as an appetite suppressant. A lot of people think that it was first synthesized by Merck in 1912 and patented a year later. But they never tested it on any person or human. It was actually a stepping stone for the creation of hydrosteinin, which is a blood pressure medication. And at the time in Germany, you patented the process of making a drug, not just the end result. And so to prevent competitors from copying hydrosteinin, they patented all of these drugs that could be used to create it. And MDMA happens to be one of them. And then really it wasn't known about, no one really heard about it until rumors in the 1950s that the US Army was using it as part of their MK Ultra and their efforts to obtain a truth serum, which is kind of a euphemism for torture drugs, which is really disturbing to me when you think of it that way, because substances that can be so beautiful and enlightening and healing, like the psychedelics, were also used in an effort to do some of the most darkest things you can imagine. But then I spoke with neuroscientist Matthew Baggett. What was that, Ashley?
I said, but failed in that respect.
Yeah, thank goodness, right? Yeah, thank goodness. Yeah. That maybe that says something about these substances. And Matthew Baggett, a neuroscientist, however, thinks it likely wasn't used in these Army studies because MDA ended up causing a fatality, which didn't come out for years later, and then the family has sued the Army because of it. And if you look at the names, all of the drugs that they used in these secret studies have code names, and they follow this sort of numerical alphabetical order. And then MDMA has this code number attached to it that it doesn't follow any order at all. So really there's no hard evidence that even the US Army used it. All we know then is that some, well, PharmChem, even before Sasha Shulgin re-synthesized it, PharmChem, which was a lab that tested street drugs, found it on the street in, the mid-70s. And Sasha also got a letter from someone in Germany saying, hey, how do you synthesize the methylated version of MDA? And he responded to the letter because he knew how to do it, though he hadn't done it yet. And then like some woman, a graduate student, said to Sasha, hey, you should try the methylated version of MDA. And he did. Of course, he can't remember who it was, and he's passed on now. And many of us has tried to find out who was this person. How did she know? Right? All we know is it's a woman, and she knew about it. So then, of course, Sasha Shulgin, psychedelic chemist, resynthesized it, recognized its therapeutic properties, and gave it to his friend and colleague, the psychotherapist Leo Zeff. He's kind of the unsung hero of MDMA therapy because everyone's heard of Sasha, but nobody's heard of Leo. And Leo's kind of the Johnny Appleseed of MDMA. He came out of retirement and traveled the world training therapists in how to use it. At the time, in the US, it was the height of the drug war, although some people might say we're still at the height of the drug war, and that's a reasonable argument. But back then it was Nancy Reagan and Just Say No and all this, and the therapeutic community knew that if it leaked out into the public, that it would be used in recreational settings, and the government would crack down on it. And so they tried to keep it under wraps. They gave it the code name Atom. They didn't even want to use MDMA. because they didn't really want it to get out. But of course, the inevitable happened, and this group in Texas started selling it at nightclubs, just called the Texas Group. And in Dallas, particularly around the Stark Club. And there's a new documentary that's just coming out now about the Stark Club that I got to watch the pre-release of, and it's really good. The whole last third of it is about MDMA and how it positively impacted the culture in Texas.
What's it called?
I think it's called the Stark Club or Stark or something. Yeah. You'll know this. Mhm. And so then Senator Benson from Texas decided to make it his issue to crack down on the new demon drug, and the DEA banned it. And this is 1985. And then a coalition of therapists sued the DEA, saying this drug has medicinal potential. We've been using it for a decade. And it went to court, and they won the case. The administrative law judge, Francis Young, ruled in favor of the therapists, saying it should be Schedule 2, not Schedule 1. But to make a long story short, it was just an advisory hearing, and the DEA chose to ignore their own judge's ruling, and they just kept it Schedule 1 ever since. And that's when Rick Doblin founded MAPS to help legalize MDMA and other psychedelics again. And now here we are 30 years later, and looks like there's light at the end of the tunnel. Rick says 2021 MDMA should be approved by the FDA for the treatment of PTSD. I'd like to point out that's not the end all of the movement for rational drug policy, however, because even if a few thousand veterans a year are able to get these medical sessions with a therapist, that's not going to touch the recreational market at all. And we're still going to have adulterated drugs. We're still going to have the lack of education that's contributing to misuse and abuse, not to mention people being arrested and going to prison. So we still have a lot of work to do even after it's approved medically.
Thank you.
I'm sorry if that was a little long. I was like,
it was such good information. Thank you for sharing all of that. So I'd like to kind of jump into the work that's happening at MAPS, and I know a lot of the work that you're doing with your film is interviewing people who have had experience with the MDMA therapy. I checked with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and they are reporting there that 15% of those that have gone to war are diagnosed with PTSD when they come back. And I know we talked about this previously, Emanuel. There's some really scary statistics out there about the number of veterans that commit suicide every day. And we've heard numbers somewhere between 22 to 25 or 26, I think, in that range. And so this is something that I think is really important for us to be looking at, is how do we support the veterans who have come back from war and have experienced really horrific things to heal and to integrate and to have a quality of life that they can really enjoy. So I'd love if you could share some of your insights and experience that you've had with some of the veterans that you've interviewed or otherwise connected with.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Yeah, it's been a real privilege, in fact, to have interviewed these courageous individuals. And everyone calls veterans courageous, but the one thing that I learned, some of the most compassionate and caring individuals in our country joined the military after 9/11 and went off to fight. And sometimes we may forget that because we like to think of warriors as being like these super strong, tough, and hard, thick-skinned guys. But 9/11 really shocked our country, and it really shocked a lot of young people, and it took a lot of courage, and people went to war with often some of the most caring, compassionate, and sensitive constitutions of people that we know. And your statistics are right around the number of suicides, although I'm willing to bet that the number is about 23 a day. More veterans have killed themselves after returning than we have lost soldiers in combat. It's a staggering number, and I think 3 years ago nobody kind of new. It's only been like the last 3 years where public awareness of the PTSD epidemic now is just really, everyone knows it. And another reason why I think the time is right to make this movie. Because MDMA really is absolutely hands down the best treatment that we know of for PTSD. I think that rates of PTSD may be higher than what the military is reporting or the VA is reporting at 15%, though. You know, it's not in their interest to diagnose people with PTSD because it costs so much money to treat. So the other thing I learned in interviewing these subjects is that PTSD, at least among all of the people I interviewed, and that's 4 veterans and a rape survivor, PTSD is very tied into a person's self-identity, particularly around issues of guilt or shame, whether it's having not done enough to save the life of your fellow soldiers or having accidentally killed innocent people. Even a rape survivor, Rachel Hope, who I interviewed, who was a victim as a child, you know, you can wonder, how can a child blame themselves for that? But that's what really happens. For decades, she thought to herself, there must be something wrong with me for these awful things to have happened to me. And so to the degree that MDMA produces feelings of self-acceptance and self-forgiveness, self-love, that has been a crucial aspect that all of the PTSD subjects I've interviewed have told me was crucial to helping them heal. I was able to have compassion for myself for the first time in 6 years, a Marine veteran told me. But there are, however, more substantial, or I should say scientific mechanisms of action for MDMA therapy that I could talk about if you like.
That would be great.
Sure. Let me say too that, you know, thank you for inviting me on this show. I have spent a lot of time over the past couple of years researching this and interviewing people, but I'm not an MDMA therapist. And I want to give a shout out to those Michael and Annie Mithover and Marcella Otolora, who are doing this work for with the studies. It would be great for you to have them on the show one time too, because I'm sure they could bring some experiences. They may not be able to talk about the personal details, but whereas I can, at least those who've shared them with me, because on camera, you know. So the traditional like mechanism of action, what's said, you know, how does MDMA work therapeutically, is that in reducing the fear response, the activity in the amygdala, while simultaneously increasing activity in the frontal cortex, making you alert and very aware, the individual can engage in discussions about these past traumatic events without having the fear or panic reaction that normally happens. And then they can integrate them, sort of make new neural pathways, strengthen new electrochemical thoughts in the brain, such that even when they're no longer on the drug, when they remember the events, they it doesn't trigger the panic. And that's certainly true. Some very interesting new theories have come out, though, including some new studies that seem to show that MDMA also has a therapeutic effect on PTSD that doesn't need to involve talk therapy or really any kind of language at all. That there's something just biochemically about taking this drug that reduces stress and the fear response, and to the degree that MDMA is a heightened stress response. And veterans talk about, you know, being hypervigilant constantly throughout the day and nightmares and can't sleep. It seems there are symptoms that are there all the time, even when you're not specifically remembering those traumatic events. And MDMA helps veterans with those symptoms too. So this one recent study that's come out was, it's actually one of the first might be the only, don't quote me on this, it might be the only therapeutic study not funded by MAPS, where animals, rats, were given MDMA to see how it affected what they call fear extinction training, which is kind of like PTSD therapy. A way you give a rat PTSD or traumatize it typically is you shock them with the electricity. So these studies, they would shock a part of the cage. When the rat went to that part of the cage, they got an electric shock, and they learned to fear that part of the cage. And if you move them to that part of the cage, you could see their fear. And then they do what's called fear extinction training, which is sort of like phobia extinction, where they slowly try to get the rats not to fear that part of the cage anymore, and over time they'll eventually walk over there and they're not afraid anymore. And they used MDMA on half the rats, and placebo, double blind, all that, right? And discovered that the rats that were given MDMA had significantly improved more and faster. They lost their fear of that corner of the cage. So it assists. What's that?
From sort of a more chemical perspective rather than the actual cognitive parts, because you said that it wasn't necessarily having to do with talk therapy, but obviously a lot of what comes out of these experiences is a lot of internal dialogue and processing. So it's not just that kind of language-based sort of higher thinking, but it's also the chemical aspect of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you bring up a question, is like, how much did the rats actually sort of remember that corner of the cage? So they were having internal, what we might call thoughts about it, But that's
rationalizing it, oh, I'm away from this, scary place now, or whether you're, and so I don't need to fear that, and sort of self-talking yourself out of it rather than just not feeling afraid. Is that
right? Well, and if you look at MDMA therapy, if you look at the protocols, it's a very non-directed form of therapy. It's not deep psychoanalysis. The therapist is only there really to sort of help the person sort of come back to the trauma experience if they've gone off on tangents way too long. But those tangents are often also very important, I'm told, because it's part of the integration process, and many people say PTSD is always or very often kindled by childhood traumatic experiences. So it might not be the war experience directly that caused it, but the war experience plus these forgotten memories that have happened when you were a child, and or even your relationships with people around you. The relationship aspect is also ultimately important. In every single case of the people I interviewed with PTSD, it was their relationships with others that were the focus of their trauma, and what that the healing was largely a healing of their understanding of their relationships with themselves as well. And anyone who's done MDMA recreationally knows about MDMA and its strengthening your personal relationships, right? It produces feelings of empathy and acceptance of yourself and others. And so that makes perfect sense that PTSD would be related to your relationships too. There's a second study they're doing now with the rats, though, to sort of take this concept a bit further, which is they then can re-traumatize the rats after they've undergone a fear extinction. Poor rats, yeah. And they're not only right back to the same fear of that corner of the cage as they were before, but now it takes even longer for fear extinction training to work a second time. What the hypothesis is that the rats that were given MDMA during the first fear extinction training will be able to recover from that trauma more quickly the second time than the previous rats. And why that's important is that it doesn't, that shows that there's something deeper going on with the MDMA rather than just, oh, well, you just made them forget about the experience, right? Oh, they just lost their memory of the experience. Well, so if you do it a second time, you can show, no, we're actually disconnecting the experience from the emotional response. And that's what what the researchers believe who are doing these studies, that memory has, there's different types of memory. You have episodic memory, and then you have emotional memory. And what happens in PTSD is those things get connected in this really traumatic way. If you can disconnect or if you can reset the emotional memory with MDMA that's associated with this event, then, well, you have healing that's going on.
Mm. So that, I mean, what came up for me when you were saying that was that, I mean, maybe that may be how PTSD is actually occurring, because if a person was traumatized as a child at some point, and then they get re-traumatized, you know, and maybe they kind of able to kind of recover as they become an adult, but then they get re-traumatized when they're at war, then it's much harder to become, like, get back down to baseline. So it sounds like that's almost what those rats were experiencing.
Yeah, that could be. And if you look at like what happens when you join the military, I mean, to create an effective fighting force, you turn these young men and women into killers. You literally have to, you know, harden them. I mean, this is why, you know, boot camp is, you know, they yell at you. And so there's a lot of ways in which you're primed to be traumatized, and ways in which that's going to link back and relate to your previous experiences and your relationships with others. Yeah.
Emanuel, I'm wondering a little bit about, so we're moving into phase 3 studies for FDA approval on this, and then this could be a regular viable therapy treatment available for veterans. What are the current treatments that veterans would receive for PTSD, and how does that relate to what we know about the effectiveness of MDMA from the current studies?
Well, there aren't very many effective treatments for PTSD right now. What you typically get is drugs, like benzodiazepines. Probably before that, they'll try SSRIs. Zoloft is one of the ones approved mostly. Some vets have told me they were given antipsychotic medications. Which is often worse than the PTSD itself, numbing your mind. Maybe they control some symptoms, but none of them help in any progressive long-term way, with the possible exception of SSRI-assisted psychotherapy. You got to remember, SSRIs also work on serotonin. So that makes sense that extra serotonin from your Zoloft would, you know, give you a little bit of relief and assist in the therapy process. Some things I know that have worked better are the EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. You know, because like a lot of times, like when you get into a panic and you're feeling stress, your eyes do certain things, and the eye movement reinforces the whole emotional state. So it's about disconnecting those eye movements from the memory, and then you sort of get more control over how you can think about an event. That's been very helpful too. But none of these therapies have been as successful as MDMA. In the phase 2 studies, which just completed, 83% of the subjects no longer met the criteria for PTSD at their 2-month follow-up. And you got to understand, 1 to 3 sessions. Yeah. Actually, some of the participants got more if they got a low dose during the first 3. Every veteran was guaranteed, if they chose to, that when the blind was broken and they saw what they got, that they were able to then, if they want to, get more sessions so that it would equal 3 at 125 milligrams, 3 sessions at the high dose. So some of them opted in to do those extra sessions. But the results I'm reporting are from the 1 to 3, from the 3, regardless of what dose it was. The extra sessions, I don't believe, were figured into this 83% statistic. And one thing to know is that for the FDA to approve these studies, they put a lot of requirements on MAPS. The veterans or the patients, whether they were veterans or not with PTSD, they had to meet a rigorous set of criteria, which essentially was these were severe and treatment-resistant cases of PTSD. Because the FDA was saying, well, this is an illegal drug, and if you're going to do this, okay, but we want to make sure that there's no other recourse for these people. So they had to have tried other forms of treatment. It didn't work. So these were, cases, individuals who were treatment resistant. And when you think about that, and that there's an 83% rate of cure, and I don't like to say cure, but there's a whole long list of questions you answer. They're called CAPS scores. It's like, 100 pages you fill out. How many nightmares have you had? Has this happened? Rating from 1 to 5, et cetera. And then they combine it all. And there's a criteria, threshold you have to meet to be considered to have PTSD. You might be more of a stress puppy than someone else, like me. But I don't have PTSD. I wouldn't meet those scores, right? So that's what, when you say cure, we're talking about they would no longer qualify for PTSD. So you got to think of what would happen for normal cases of PTSD if the result is so high. Right. And this is.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
As part of the phase 3, do you know if it's again going to be on those treatment-resistant PTSD cases, or are they opening it up to kind of anyone with PTSD?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good question. I would think they would open it up at this point because it's a lot more subjects and it might be harder to find that many. But I don't know. That's a good question for Rick or the Mythovers or someone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
And okay.
Just real quick, I did want to also remind the audience that we would love to take your questions as well. So on your screen, there's a Q&A button and you can type those in. And as those come in, we'll be able to see those and share those as well. So any of our viewers, we thank you so much for being here. Let us know. You can give us comments or questions and we'll address those as well. And what were you going to say, Emanuel?
Yeah, I was just going to say, when MDMA first came out and therapists started using it, it was the psychedelic therapy community that embraced it, right? It was Sasha who discovered it. And I think that the DEA at the time just thought to themselves, oh, this is just another claim by those druggies that another psychedelic of theirs is therapeutic, Now, I don't diss at all the claims that mushrooms, LSD, ayahuasca, that these other psychedelics can be therapeutic. The DEA was wrong to poo-poo that too, right? There's tremendous evidence that people are being helped. But the kind of healing that happens with MDMA is different. It's exactly the kind of healing that mainstream therapists across the world are constantly trying to get from their patients, right? It's a hard experience. It's about relationships. It's about forgiving your father. It's about, understanding your spouse. It's like, it really is in a class that's different. And, I think we can forgive the DEA for not knowing that back in 1985, and give them some kudos because they're actually approving the studies. They have to approve these studies as well as the FDA. And they have approved studies that are currently underway, not just for PTSD, but for treating end-of-life anxiety in terminally ill patients. That's happening right now in Marin County, north of the Bay Area. Also using it with autistic adults down in San Diego. Alicia Danceforth and Charlie Grove are doing those studies. So things are changing, and I think it's very hopeful. Another thing I want to say that the late Dr. Richard Rockefeller spoke about when he gave a talk at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. He tragically died in a plane crash, but he's a big supporter of MDMA therapy and contributed money to the studies. He was the board president of Doctors Without Borders. Really amazing guy. I'm actually going to be dedicating my movie to him. And he said something really profound that I think everyone should know about PTSD and psychedelics. And that is that in many ways, LSD was banned, and what we call like the second wave of the drug war, right? Then when Nixon declared Timothy Leary public enemy #1, starts arresting, tens of thousands of marijuana and LSD users. That LSD was banned largely because of our inability as a culture to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. And you're like, what? But in a very real way, and he explained, there was no time in this country that we had a greater percentage of the population with PTSD than after World War II. They didn't call it PTSD then, they called it shell shock. But, there were so many soldiers coming home and with PTSD. And how did we deal with that as a culture? Well, we repressed it. And if you look at 50s culture, you can see that. Everything is like, messages of everything's great, we're on top of the world, right? Show tunes and Father Knows Best, and this like kind of 50s culture that looks kind of weird and like creepy to people now, right? And really that's because it was partly about not dealing with this horrid, problem in our country after World War II. And if you look at who the flower children of the 60s were, they were the children of these veterans. So they saw the disconnect between what their country was telling them, that everything's great and we're on top of the world and you should be happy and, do what your parents say, to the reality of their home life with suicide and domestic violence. And then suddenly we want to send them to go fight another war. Right at the same time that LSD appeared on the scene. And LSD, clearly a cognitive psychic enhancer that can snap people out of habitual ways of thinking and start thinking differently. LSD got associated with the war and with an anti-establishment, sort of vibe around it. It was, tune in, turn on, drop out. And this scared the heck out of the Nixon administration and that generation who was part of the World War II generation, who didn't want to deal with their own trauma and were continuing to repress it. Well, and that's how psychedelics sort of became associated with its anti-establishment sort of thing. That's not the case anymore today. Rick is always talking about how, Rick Doblin, that, these days the drug war is no longer driven by this fear that people are going to use psychedelics and then they're going to become anti-American. Nobody thinks that anymore. It's only driven these days by parents fearing that their kids are going to get in trouble with drugs. And if we look at what's happening with MDMA right now, where the U.S. military, right, the DOD and the VA are getting involved in the studies, it gives me so much hope that here we have another psychedelic that's appeared on the scene, and we're finally starting to give it the credit it's due. It's better than LSD in treating PTSD. And we may start actually dealing with PTSD in a healthy way in our culture that's not just going to help veterans and maybe slow down the war machine, but also help integrate psychedelics back into society where they should be.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions. Do you want to read there on that side?
Yeah, Mike wants to know when the movie's coming out.
Oh, that's a great question.
That's a question of, like, when I was in grad school, it's like, what are you doing after you graduate? Like, oh, don't ask me.
What I like to tell people is if we had all the funding we needed tomorrow, it would be done in a year. I predicted that it would be done in 2016. That's not going to happen now. I should let viewers know we have recently finished our private placement memorandum, which is fancy legalese for our investor legal entity, and we are accepting accredited investors. We have our first 2 already. So if you know anybody who's interested, they should give me a call. Of course, we also accept donations. Those can be funneled through a nonprofit for tax deduction too. But we have hope that we're going to make money off this film, and so investors have the opportunity to earn some interest. So
beautiful. So if anybody does want to donate or may have an investor connection, how would they connect with you in the movie?
Oh, they can email me at info@mdmathemovie.com, or just go to mdmathemovie.com and there's a contact page there.
Great. Awesome. You want to do one more question?
Sure. Well, I'll read. There's one comment, and then there's one question. So Joseph said, 29% of all Vietnam veterans, male and female, suffered an acute or post-traumatic stress disorder, while another 22% experienced at least some stress symptoms. So I think it's some numbers there. And then Caroline had a question. This is more kind of, I guess, broader overview of MDMA, but she asked if at TGI, I guess this is sort of like a urban myth or something, that TGI Fridays had low-dose MDMA in their breath mints in the late 70s. Have you heard of anything like that?
You know, if they did, and they weren't telling people that, they should have been prosecuted and shut down, because the only thing that should be legal about drug, well, not the only thing, but one major thing is you should never dose anybody without them knowing. I don't know about TGI Fridays, and I would think it would get in the way of the minty flavor. You know, it doesn't. It's got a pretty bitter taste to it.
Yeah, it has to be really, really sugary. Funny, yeah. That, and I think that's kind of a good point to just say that, you know, there's a lot of bad information out there. There's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of urban myths. So, you know, part of what we're trying to do here with the Aware Project, and, you know, obviously what you're doing with your movie, is to try and break through some of that bad information and give people more accurate information, more balanced information, so they can make better decisions.
Love that mission, and it's so certainly true, and it's purely a result of prohibition and drug war culture, because there are no authorities around illicit drugs in our culture. If you think about it, no one in a position of authority wants to tell the truth, because everybody fears they're going to get accused of, you know, promoting drug use. They're only allowed to say bad things. And so teachers won't tell students the truth about drugs. Even parents are afraid to tell their kids that they did psychedelics back in the day, you know, because, well, I mean, I understand. We have a moralistic culture, and you could get judged, right? So this creates a vacuum where there are no checks to the crazy things that young people say. And I've heard people, you know, say the craziest things about different illicit drugs, and they say them with such a tone of authority, like they know, you know, like MDMA drains your spinal fluid, you know, and if you do LSD 7 times, you are certifiably insane. And of course, everybody knows that, right? And there's so many of the other ones.
I saw a good one. I think it was on Facebook that said, they're like, you know, there was like, oh, you know, Halloween candy that has MDMA on it that they're giving to kids. And there was a good point that was, why would you waste perfectly good MDMA giving it to kids?
Yeah, and to address that more seriously, I was just down in Los Angeles speaking to the LA County Rave or Electronic Music Festival Task Force, who's considering banning electronic music events as a response to drug use and to fatalities that happened this summer. And the police were represented there, and they actually produced some literature that they distributed to at a show the night before. That was their best effort at harm reduction literature. And, you know, it had some good points about if you get in trouble, what to do and whatnot. But then everything that it said about the effects of MDMA was like reefer madness style scare tactics. You know, and afterwards I approached the police chief and I said, you know, well, actually, in my public comment, I talked about it and said, you're going to lose the trust of young people if you're, you know, only saying negative things. It's not just that 90% of what they said wasn't true, you know, that long-term ecstasy use causes hemorrhaging and psychosis and, you know, liver failure and things like that. But even their short-term effects contained nothing positive. And so afterwards I said, do you think anyone would want to use the drug if these were the only effects of it? And that, you know, like, obviously you're missing something here, right? But, and to me, it's just, as a drug educator and founding a peer-to-peer drug education program where I'm talking to drug users, MDMA users about, you know, like you have to acknowledge and recognize the positive effects of drugs if you want credibility from young people who, you know, they're not going to listen to anything you say. And I'm really worried that because of, you know, this absence of anything positive, you know, they had like 30 different effects of MDMA, and it was all things that, like, you would, you know, why would you ever want to do it? Police in particular are in a very difficult position in trying, you know, to appeal and keep their reputation up with all segments of society, including, you know, parents and conservatives, etc. And it's really hard for them, I understand, to like bring themselves to say anything that could be construed as saying that that an illegal drug like might have a positive benefit. I think the same thing happens, you know, when we're talking about teachers and any, you know, public officials. It's one of the biggest hurdles to rational drug policies. And I'm really glad that you're there, that you guys are out there as sort of out and proud psychedelic users to say, hey, you know, these drugs have benefits. That's never been my role, and I've never really done that as a harm reduction activist and drug educator. I've spent most of the last 2 decades educating people on the risks and dangers. Now, in the DanceSafe literature, we also mentioned the positive effects, but I never talked about my own use of the drug. I tried to steer clear of that. Now that I'm sort of independent and just making this movie, I am going to do that. And really, seeing things have only gotten worse over the last 18 years since I've started DanceSafe. The number of fatalities has quadrupled. We're seeing about 20 deaths a year. The misuse and abuse of MDMA in the recreational scene is way worse than it was back in 1998 when I founded DanceSafe. And DanceSafe's been around all this time, right? So, you know, like, things have just gotten worse despite our efforts to make them better. I think perhaps I didn't go enough in being willing to say, look, that these drugs have benefits, because what I've learned is that creating a responsible drug-using culture is the goal. That it's more effective in reducing harm to teach people how to use the drug properly, because then they'll respect it, they'll treat it as sacred, if we only teach people the risks, if you do this, you can die, you know, even if those are perfectly accurate, you know, it's a negatively framed campaign. And every child rearing book that you read tells you that, you know, discipline, etc., that positive reinforcement always works better than negative reinforcement. That, you know, framing things positively, when you want your child to not to do something, it's better to create the positive opposite and tell them what it is you want them to do. And so when it comes to teenagers, young adults who are experimenting with drugs, we want them to have a positive attitude about these drugs. Now that scares a lot of people, right? Because they're like, oh, you know, like that saying it's okay and all that. You know, most of the risks and dangers of using MDMA today are a result of prohibition. Mm-hmm. Back in the 70s, when it was being sold legally in nightclubs in Texas and other places, they'd also give you a little handout that would tell you, you know, don't take more than one. You know, you knew that there was 125 milligrams in the pill. You knew that you weren't getting something fake. There was no fear in the culture. So promoting health and safety around the drug was just common. After prohibition, we pushed all of that, you know, openness underground, and now we have uneducated, miseducated populations, and people don't know what they're taking. It's young people see it as a rebellious kind of party drug. Here's a great example of how our culture screws everything up. Have you seen the movie Dope?
I haven't seen that one.
I haven't seen it either.
I don't know that one.
Dope is a great film. It's hysterical. I love it. It's about these high school kids that get caught up with this gang, and they have to sell, like, you know, 5 pounds of Molly or something like that, or they're going to get killed. I mean, so they have to do it, right? So that removes the moral thing for them. They just have to, or they're going to kill her. So what do? They set up a vendor account on a darknet market like Silk Road, and they start packaging it in their high school and they sell it. And it's really funny, and but there's one major glaring problem with it, and that is the representations of people on the drug in the movie are ridiculous. You take Molly, oh no, they make sure we all know it's pure, right? It's real MDMA. They got the best stuff, right? You take Molly and you go crazy, right? And we have to understand the learning curve to educate people on the effects of various drugs, because most people, the vast majority, haven't used any illegal drug. Maybe they smoke pot, you know, but alcohol is the only thing they know to compare anything to. And here's what, this is hard to like really accept, but here's what most people think of around illegal drugs. They're all exactly the same. What happens is you take them, they disinhibit you, you lose control, and you do things that you regret, and they're addictive. They give you so much pleasure, it disinhibits you, and you lose control. Literally, that's what most people, they think that's what LSD does, that's what heroin does, that's what, you know, meth does. Maybe some are uppers and some are downers, but generally that's all they think, because they've never done them. They've never seriously talked to people who have taken these drugs to find out what the effects really are. That's the fear, and that's what we really have to understand if we're going to educate and end this drug war, because it's an irrational fear. Even though sometimes those things happen, right? But they really don't happen with MDMA. Yet, young people often go into the experience thinking that that's not only what's going to happen, but that's what's supposed to happen, because they watch movies like Dope, and that's what they're told. And what you bring into your experience when you take a psychedelic largely determines what you're going to get out of it. And so we're really priming young people for misuse and abuse in the very way that we deal with psychedelics in our site through prohibition. So we're I remember Rick Doblin told me early on when I founded DanceSafe, he was just feeling me out, and he said, well, you know, we're about benefit enhancement more than we're about harm reduction. And I was like, that's great. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. And now more than ever, I realize those two things go hand in hand. And when we teach people how to maximize the benefits, we do more in reducing the harm than if we just teach about the harms. And you know who's really cutting edge on this is Adam Winstock in the UK. He does the Global Drug Survey, with the largest survey of drug users in the world. And he talks about, safe drug use is more pleasurable drug use. How can you have the most fun using drugs is the same thing as how can you reduce the harms and the negative sides of using drugs. And if we get rid of the judgment and the stigma, and certainly people will develop problems with addiction and abuse. That's always going to happen. We deal with that on a case-by-case basis. We have programs for it. We let doctors and public health officials worry about that. But the prohibition is actually creating the very misuse that it pretends to be solving. So we need to go on the offensive if we really want to protect public health and safety, as well as the civil rights of adults. While I'm on this, can I say one more thing?
A couple more minutes.
Okay. When people think about legalization, they tend to equate that with liberalization, because the model that we have is marijuana. And the truth is, voters are not concerned about increasing access of marijuana to minors. Every state that's passed medical or recreational laws has allowed backyard cultivation, and one of the goals is actually the establishment of a retail taxable market. So, but marijuana is in a very privileged position. It hasn't caused any deaths. Right? The marijuana legalization movement has not been driven by harm reduction. Legalized because we have a right to use it. Okay, also the medical side, but it's been largely a civil rights argument. Okay, and that's good. That's important. Other drugs need to be legalized and regulated in ways, however, that reduce access to minors, because the impetus for legalization, along with the civil rights of adults, is to protect young people. And here's the thing, teenagers these days can more easily buy Molly, whatever it is, than they can alcohol, because at least with alcohol, they have to go to an adult to get it for them. So if we legalized and strictly regulated MDMA so that adults had safe legal access in limited quantities to pure MDMA, not only would we dramatically shrink the criminal illicit market and all of the adulterants that are on it, because who in the right mind would buy a mystery powder when they could get pure MDMA from a dispensary, right? But we would also reduce access to minors. We would. And that's a good thing. People then ask, well, how much should we allow adults to get, say, per month? And my answer, as much as it takes to eliminate the illicit criminal market, right? Well, yes, there will be adults that are going to buy it and give it to teenagers. That'll remain illegal, but it happens with alcohol. It'll still happen. And some of that we just need to accept because the alternative is what we have now, right? Where 20 people a year are dying and more than thousands are going to emergency rooms. So 20 a year is not a lot, by the way, right? Compared to other illicit drugs. And, there have been a lot of articles you've seen recently that have been talking about that, how, horseback riding is more dangerous, et cetera. And, I agree with those things, but, I've never stressed that in my work, because my work has been about reducing the number even more. Like, I work with parents who have lost their children to help them, to learn why it's happening, for one. And we could do another show on that. But sorry, we've diverted from therapy.
No, that's okay. Good information. Thank you so much for sharing. It's great to see and hear your passion on the subject. Did we have one more question that came in?
Yeah, we'll just do it really quick. So Joseph asked, how will FDA approval of MDMA in 2020 affect the conversation around recreational use and electronic music festivals?
That's a good question. I think it actually is going to have a dramatic effect because really public perception of the inherent risk of a drug drives drug policy more than rational discussion on the best policy approaches to reduce harm. When people fear MDMA, that motivates them to support zero tolerance approaches that just increase drug-related harm. Whereas, you know, as people started becoming aware that marijuana didn't make you go crazy and didn't kill people and it was medical, public perception softened around marijuana, and it's leading to legalization efforts. And that's going to happen with MDMA too, which is why the medical legalization, I think, is going to have a big effect on public perception of recreational use too. And that's gonna lead to legal regulation of MDMA also. I'm 100% convinced about this. You know, I'm 46 and I got started in this in my late 20s, and I have seen the incredible differences between today and back then. Okay, you know, the rave task force was, you know, afraid to adopt harm reduction because of the Rave Act and all that, but the conversation was all about harm reduction, and that never would have happened. I met with the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy just a few weeks ago with Dee Dee Goldsmith, who is the mother of a young woman, Shelley, who died after taking MDMA from heat stroke in a super hot nightclub, 100+ degrees, and she wants to see the Rave Act amended in order to free promoters and venue owners to be able to, without fear, implement safety measures and take a harm reduction approach. And we met with the ONDCP, who like understood what we were saying and were for the most part very supportive. It was a shock to me that I was there. I couldn't have conceived of that happening, you know, 15 years ago or even 5 years ago. You know, we have naloxone now that is a big, you know, being given to police officers and they're required to use it. We're seeing a lot of progress. So people have to remember the drug war is this blip. It's only been around about 100 years. You know, it's a blip, and it's caused such a tremendous suffering and death. It's gonna go away, and it's gonna happen as quickly as it's
sustainable. You know, and that's one of the things that, I mean, in being part of this conversation, it's like there's no doubt in my mind that these things will come to a place where we have to have a relationship, because they're not going away. And if anything, there's more information about them and more access to them through the internet and through more connectivity. So, I mean, there's something that's got to give. And so I think it's sort of a course correcting system. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are casualties of that course correcting system. So,
Did you see the Lisa Ling show?
The one where she went down to South America? Or
no, she went to Mysteryland. It's all about EDM festivals and MDMA.
Oh, we'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, it aired just last week. It's incredible. I mean, you want to see the progress that's being made. You know, she had acknowledged that she was a 90s rave queen, she said, right? So this is what's happening. The young people who were using DanceSafe services back in the late 90s are now in positions of power. They're in public health, they're in the media, and things really are different today. So.
Right, which is one of the, you know, really one of the core values of the Aware Project as well, is to invite people to step out of the psychedelic closet. And like you were saying yourself, you didn't really talk about your own use of it previously, and now you're stepping into that space. And I think that's where we have the ability to make the most impact, is that when we bring our voice to the subject, then we can make change, and, you know, people can realize that they don't have to be in fear, that we can speak about this and actually make changes that make sense.
Yeah, they've shown that the people that tend to vote in favor of medical marijuana if they've never done marijuana before, are people that know someone that has done or has used medical marijuana. So the more that we tell our stories and talk about, you know, and give accurate information about the use of these things and the benefits and harms of these things in balance, that gives people a more information to actually make a decision that's based rationally.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the way in which psychedelic users are going to feel free and capable to come out and speak proudly about the benefits in their use is if they become familiar with the language of harm reduction, so that they, you know, can speak confidently without fear they're coming across as like irresponsible or saying, oh yeah, we want this to be more available in Kmart. You know, it's just there's language to use, there's discussions that we have to have that bring together the civil rights and the protection of public health. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they go hand in hand, as the drug war has proven, because if we try to prohibit drugs entirely, all we do is relinquish control to criminals, and criminals don't ask for ID, you know, which is why, you know, teenagers can more easily get Molly than alcohol. And so, you know, Schedule 1 is the abdication of drug control. It is not, prohibition actually doesn't prohibit anything. It creates flourishing, highly profitable underground drug markets that cause way more harm than good. 200,000 people have been murdered in Mexico in the last decade as a result of drug war violence. 200,000 people.
That's staggering. Staggering number.
Yeah. It'll be so fascinating how things shift as marijuana is slowly, legalization starts to, you know, the other dominoes start to fall. Yeah, it's an exciting time to be alive.
Definitely an exciting time to be alive. Well, Emanuel, I'm going to bring this to a close. I want to thank you again so much for being here. This was such a great conversation. And remind our viewers that if you'd like to find out more about his work and his video his film and support that, you can check that out at mdmathebooby.com. And I'd also just want to point people to, if you are interested in more information on MDMA and the use of treating PTSD, maps.org is a great resource for that. And if you want to put support into furthering the research that they're doing, I know they have donation buttons available on their website as well. They're really our leading force in this movement right now to legalize the use of MDMA in a therapeutic way, to support our veterans coming back into a balanced and harmonic quality of life.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Great work.
Thanks.